Right, hello everybody. Welcome to this webinar. We've got quite a lot of people have joined. I'm sure more people will join, but I'll just start with some introductions. First of all, thank you for coming. This is hosted by the South Yorkshire Mayoral Combined Authority and the policy team. We lead on the weekly briefings, which I hope a lot of you get to read and support the work of the Mayor and the Combined Authority. So these webinar series are a really important opportunity to deep dive into a lot of the issues across a range of areas. So today we're really grateful to be joined by Dan Turner, who does work at the Combined Authority as the Senior Advisor to the Mayor, but is also a research fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School. So he's going to talk about a paper that they've pulled together recently with the former Shadow Chancellor Ed Balls and a leading economist called Anna Stansbury. So that's going to look at tackling the UK's regional economic inequality. So that was produced in March earlier this year, and it's going to look at some of the reasons why the UK is one of the most unequal countries, one of the most unequal industrialized economies in terms of per capita, productivity and disposable income. So we're going to be looking at some of those factors today. But before that, I'm just going to outline the structure of the session today. We're going to have roughly around 20-25 minutes from Dan presenting some of the findings, and then we're going to have about 30 minutes for a question and answer session. So in terms of questions, feel free to put them throughout the presentation in the chat. But if you want to ask a question, feel free to put your hand up or put the raise hand function on here. And we are going to record the presentation for those who are unable to make it today. So if you're able to just put yourself on mute before Dan begins to talk, and if you are more comfortable turning your screens off, that's absolutely fine. It is nice to see people, so thank you to those who are doing that now. So yeah, without further ado, over to Dan Turner.
Fab, thank you, Dominic. Thanks everyone for joining. Lovely to see some externals as well as the home crowd from SYMCA. I was thinking while Dominic was chatting about trying to find a gag for homecoming gigs, having seen Arctic Monkeys 2 weeks ago, Pulp in a fortnight, but this is going to be way less rock and roll. So to manage expectations down, you'll get ready for a roller coaster of 20 minutes of stats and diagrams, and then we can dive into whatever is helpful for you all. Let me see if I can get this screen working. Is that all right? Can you see? Dominic, what does it look like at the moment? Am I on presentation mode?
If you just press the presentation bit at the bottom. And
okay,
yeah,
how's that? Can you see it?
All good.
Right, yeah. Perfect. So this is a paper by way of context that sits alongside two other pieces in a research project that I've been undertaking over the past couple of years. So we have this as our key econometric analysis of regional inequalities in the UK. And I'll dive into the findings. Part of it is historical. I'm proposing in this presentation to look more at the analysis we have of what are the policy levers that you would pull right now in the short term if you want to see improvements in regional productivity in the UK. But there is an analysis included in the paper, which I'll make sure we link around and share after this, looking at more of the reasons of how did we get to where we are. So as well as looking at some of the more easily quantifiable metrics in this paper, we recognise, and this won't be news to many of you on the call, that lots of the challenges that the UK faces around regional inequality are not necessarily purely due to economic inputs, but are due to factors around governance, politics, administration, where it's much harder to get data of the sort that we use in this paper. So to address that whole bucket of questions, the other major piece of work that I've been doing is an oral history where we talk to policymakers who have been involved in regional policy and growth policy since the late 1970s and up to 2015, and ask them about the sorts of how they think about the sorts of issues that we would now broadly label leveling up, how their thinking has evolved over time, and their analysis when they look back on their time in office about why it is they didn't succeed or might not have as fully succeeded as they would have liked when tackling some of the issues we're going to talk around today. So that's a preamble to say, when we get into the Q&A, if you also want to talk about some of the politics, the personalities, or the governance aspects of this, I won't be able to show you a nice, well-formatted graph to explain it, but I'm happy to share some of the findings of that second paper, which we're hoping to publish early September. We'll have about 100 transcripts, which we're going to publish in full. That'll be from former prime ministers, chancellors, secretaries of state, mayors, local government chief execs, permanent secretaries, so on and so forth. And our paper, which says, here are the key lessons that we take from those interviews. So without further ado, the problem that motivates this paper, again, won't be news to you, but it's worth situating it in a global OECD challenge, that there's been a rise in regional productivity inequalities across all Western industrialized countries, with some caveats around that and nuances we can get into if you like, since the late 1970s, early 1980s. In the UK, what we argue in the paper is that this is best understood as very definitively being a productivity challenge, about London and the greater southeast versus the rest. And by that, I mean we don't think the evidence is quite so compelling on the debate that you will often hear around towns versus cities or rural areas versus city centres, and that a lot of that misses the wood for the trees, that really what's happening in the UK is London and the greater southeast is pulling ahead, and most other regions are falling behind or just about treading water and keeping pace with London and the southeast. That in turn is driven by the underperformance of large cities outside of the southeast, which don't have the role of being a dynamo that we observe in most other regions in the world. And mechanically, a lot of this is explained by education or industrial mix. So what I mean by that is, if you look at any chart of the share of graduates as one very standard metric and productivity performance of the place, you'll see that those two factors are highly correlated. So a more educated region tends to be more productive. And similarly with industry mix, lots of you will know that a place that has a higher share of knowledge intensive business services also tends to be more productive. So those are North Stars that we take into our day jobs, I'm sure. But the fact that rich places are also highly educated and also have lots of knowledge intensive business services doesn't necessarily tell you that having more people with skills or having more knowledge intensive businesses will make you more productive. You have to unpack a lot of the causal mechanisms that underlie that. And that's what motivates our paper. It's been compared by the Centre for Cities as being like a detective novel. So the structure that we take, and you can kind of see it in these tabs along the top, is we'll go suspect by suspect of what is it that's holding back the regional economies in the UK, and then try and identify exactly where the constraints are. So the academic model that we're using for this is called the binding constraints model. It comes from the work of Ricardo Hausman, Danny Roderick, and Velasco, who are three economists at the Harvard Kennedy School. They developed this model and applied it to developing country contexts. And it's only over the past 5 years or so that their team, who are called the Growth Lab at the Kennedy School, have started applying it to advanced economy contexts. They're doing a big project with Wisconsin in the US, and this paper is the first application to the UK of this model. So what the binding constraints model says is you can think about the inputs to growth, the sorts of things that we'll talk about all the time, such as access to capital, access to high quality, high skilled people, the physical infrastructure in a place, in two ways. One model, which is the one on the left, is the one of perfect substitutes, and on the right, perfect complements. So the analogy that Hausman and his co-authors use is, imagine this as a barrel. The aim is to keep as much water in the barrel as possible. The more water you have, the more productive your economy is. And it's a question of which way do the slats run. So in a world where everything's complementary, if you just have extra slats going up, you can hold more water. So it doesn't matter what it is, whether it's a little bit better transport, a little bit better skills, a little bit better access to finance or more innovation, everything you can add will improve the productivity of your regional economy. The other world is where the slats don't lie horizontally, but they lie vertically, which is the image on the right. So you can add as much as you want in this world to, for instance, skills, but if it's infrastructure that's holding back, that's the bottleneck in your local economy, it won't make any difference. So the policy implication of that is you need to identify what the bottleneck is in your particular local economy, and you address that. And the methodology to try and do that identification is to look at the indicators we can get from market mechanisms. Generally, what you would observe, and we'll get into this, I think the first case, which is around skills, illustrates it most clearly, actually, is if something is in relatively high demand and that demand is increasing, that tells you that relative to everything else a business could be demanding in an economy, or a set of consumers could be demanding in an economy, that is the binding constraint. That's the thing they're prepared to spend more money on in order to unlock bottlenecks and lead to a broader growth in the economy. All very abstract. Hopefully it will make more sense as we go. And I should have said, if anyone at any point wants to jump in, I can't see you and I can't see any hands that are raised because I just have the speaker's notes. But if you want to just turn your mic on and shout, I'm very happy to take questions as we go. I'll try and keep this short and high level and have more time for questions at the end, but please do jump in as stuff comes up. So the first thing that we look at, we look at education, infrastructure, knowledge, and access to finance as the 4 inputs. And these are 4 of the most commonly assumed components and inputs into a growth model to determine a high productivity economy. And you can think about this, if you're setting up a business, you need to hire your people, you need to make sure you have the infrastructure to move your goods or connect your services to their markets. You need to do that in an innovative way, which is knowledge, and you need to have access to money to bring it all together. So when we look at skills through this lens of being a binding constraint, the fact that low skills and low productivity go hand in hand is ambiguous. It could be that you have a low productivity economy, and therefore when people get skills, they leave because the wage that they can command as a graduate in one region is lower because of that low level of productivity. The causation could flow the other way around, which is that there are businesses that want high skilled people and can't recruit them. So what we do in the paper in order to try and understand which dynamic is at play here, is it that we have too few graduates, or is it that we have not enough demand for those graduates and so they leave, is to look at the university wage premium. So this is an established metric that's used in labor economics to understand how much are businesses willing to pay for someone who's been to university over someone who hasn't been to university, and our measure is compared to someone who just has A-levels. So what we find for all of the regions of the UK, except for London, in 1997, they all had high and fairly comparable university wage premium. So what that suggests is there was demand for university level skills across the country. As there's been a rapid expansion of university skills in the UK since 1997, which is the horizontal axis here, so it's the share of people who have university degrees, all regions have seen significant increases over that 30-year period. Is it 30 years? 22-year period. And all but London and to a lesser extent Wales have seen that as the supply of graduates has gone up, the university wage premium has gone down. And we're now in a situation where being a university graduate in any region other than London doesn't come with a corresponding benefit to your wages compared to how it was in the late 1990s. So what we think this is telling us is that supply has outstripped demand for graduates. Supply is not now in general, the binding constraint to growth in regional economies, the thing that is holding back productivity isn't a lack of graduate students in somewhere like Yorkshire. It's a lack of productive opportunities to send those graduate students towards. And that explains part of the reason why London is the exception to this, that as London has seen an expansion of its share of graduate students, it potentially, we think, has seen a corresponding share in the demand, the business demand for those graduate students. Now, we, in the full paper, and we can return to this in questions if it's helpful, deconstruct that in quite a lot more detail. And what we find is for STEM skills, this is science, technology, engineering, mathematics, that story doesn't quite hold. So there has been a corresponding increase in skills, increase in the share of the population that has STEM skills, but the wage premium has remained relatively constant, and in some places has risen, unlike general skills or LFM, which is the green curve on the diagram to the left. So LFM is law, finance, and management as a comparable, highly valued skill that was commanding the same sorts of wage premium in the late 1990s. STEM skills has seen more of an expansion. So we now have more lawyers, bankers, managers than we had in the 1990s, but the wage premium that they command for that has fallen markedly. So if it isn't education that's holding back, or the skills in a regional economy that is preventing productivity growth, the next candidate we identify for that is infrastructure. The UK has had very low transport infrastructure spending in particular relative to other OECD countries for a very long period of time. Going back to the 1990s, we have spent significantly less than most other countries as an overall quantum, although that's picked up, as you can see on the second graph to the left there, on rail over the past decade, and that's mainly a HS2 cross-rail effect. As well as spending too little as a share of GDP, we'd argue, it's been heavily skewed regionally towards London and away from places like Yorkshire and the Humber or other regions of the UK. And the net result of that is that we find borrowing, so this builds on some evidence. I haven't been talking about data or evidence as we've gone. Again, we can get to that in the questions if it's helpful. But this builds on some analysis that colleagues in the Centre for Cities did, which we integrate with evidence from Google Maps and TomTom and some data sources from the OECD to show that there are effectively two models for how you can have effective infrastructure to unlock regional growth in the UK, in any OECD country. One, which is the US model, if you look at the yellow dots in the graph on the right, is that you have lots of roads. So the vertical axis is the area accessible within 30 minutes by car, so that you can get into a city centre by car very quickly, and you have a large population who can access the city centre by car. The other alternative is you have a large share of the population and a large geographic share that can access the city centre through effective public transport, which is the European model, which are all of the lilac dots in this. What we find is that the UK does neither. So it doesn't build enough roads and it can't get people into city centres through effective private infrastructure and cars, and it doesn't invest or have a broad enough network and infrastructure for public transport either. So we're in the worst of both worlds in the UK. Sorry, and I should say before I move on, which leads us to conclude that we think infrastructure and transport infrastructure in particular, unlike skills, is probably a binding constraint to productivity in the UK. Next, we turn to look at, we're really looking at the broad category of what economists call information and coordination externalities. So this is the idea that there are public goods that are provided through innovation, which is a key driver of growth, which goes back to a series of very influential papers in the late 1980s and early 1990s. But it leads us to conclude that if you have an innovation-rich economy, and those innovation benefits tend to accumulate to a very small geographic area, so it really matters where you are and where innovation happens, then you would have increased productivity in that economy. So the way that we proxy this in the paper is we ask, where does the private sector spend R&D in order to help us understand what's called the absorptive capacity for innovation of a region? So if the private sector is spending a lot of money in Yorkshire and the Humber, or is spending a certain amount of money in Yorkshire and the Humber, that tells us something about the ability of firms, of the workforce in that area to be innovative, to absorb innovations in a way that makes economic sense because the private sector is doing it. We can compare that information about the private sector's appetite for innovation with how the public sector spends its money. And that's the two maps on the left. So the blue, the darker the blue, the more that government spends disproportionately above what you would expect, given what we know from the private sector's appetite for R&D spending. And what you can see there is that in Scotland and London, consistently, there is an over-allocation of public funding, and therefore those positive innovation spillovers relative to what you would expect by the private sector. For higher education, actually, Yorkshire's an example where we do relatively well compared to the Midlands or the Northwest. But for non-higher education spending, again, government R&D is lower than we would expect for Yorkshire and the Humber. And that's stuff like UKRI or direct government spending through things like the NHS or the Ministry of Defence. By contrast, Germany is an illustration of a country that takes the exact opposite approach. So the areas in the country that have lowest productivity and lowest levels of private sector spending in Germany receive the most public funding. So it's a crowding in effect where they're using public spending to unlock more private R&D investment. The UK does the opposite. We go to the places that are already thriving regional innovation economies, and we try to turbocharge that. And there are arguments in defense of that, but one of the consequences is rising regional inequalities within the UK. In finance, we pool evidence from various surveys to show that there's, we think, limited evidence of bank lending being a constraint that varies by region. So in many cases, it's actually harder to receive bank lending in London than it is in other regions of the UK, which would suggest from the binding constraints point of view that if anything, finance is more of a barrier to productivity growth in London than it is anywhere else in the UK. However, what we did find when we were looking at it is that for equity investment, which only goes to around 4% of small firms, but they're the 4% of firms who are on the highest growth path, have the highest potential, and tend to be in the sort of sectors that will drive a structural transformation of local economy, there really is reason to worry that there's regional differentiation in access to equity. So what these two graphs show you is that the blue dots are just the generic chance of receiving equity as an SME compared to London. And you can see there for Yorkshire and the Humber, you have roughly a 1 in 4 chance of receiving equity funding as a small firm compared to a small firm in London. What we then do is we adjust it for if you're a high growth firm. So that's using the measure that some of you will be aware of from the Scale Up Institute. And it only narrowly closes the gap with London. And then the final step we take, which are the green squares, is to say, if we can control on everything we can observe about a firm, so if the firm has similar quality leaders, similar quality markets and access to markets, similar growth before it starts to seek equity investment, it is still the case that in somewhere like Yorkshire, you receive roughly, or you're roughly half as likely to receive equity investment in the first place. And then when you do receive it, which is the graph to the right, you receive about 60% of what a like-for-like firm in London would receive. Now, what we can't fully conclude from this is that equity or access to equity finance is actually a constraint to growth in the regions, because you could explain this away by saying it could be that firms in the East Midlands, the West Midlands, or Yorkshire and the Humber are just on a lower growth path. So even if they look the same up to the point of seeking equity investment, an equity investor could say your prospects for growth because of the market that you're operating in, because you're not in London, are lower. And therefore, I'm not going to invest, or I'm going to give you a lower amount when we do invest. So this is an area we call for more research into. So why is it that in the East Midlands, you're less likely to get equity finance than if you were in London? I'm a bit skeptical of the view that it is about local economic conditions. I think there is something more structural here, because I think if it was just that the growth potential of firms in the Midlands and Yorkshire was lower, that wouldn't explain why you can see the North East or Scotland do just as well as London. So I think that there is a strong argument that there are local economic factors in places like Yorkshire that are stopping there being as large an equity market as I think there ought to be. So then finally, we look at the argument that says, even if you had a totally dysfunctional market, regional inequalities, what you would expect and what we see in every country except for the UK and France in the OECD is that people just move away from poorer, struggling regions and towards the more successful growing regions. And this drives what's called convergence. So as more people move to London, the wage premium falls in London because there's more graduates. There are fewer graduates in somewhere like Yorkshire, so the price of them, their wages, rises accordingly, and supply and demand just plays out, and all of this naturally balances and converges. That doesn't happen in the UK. That doesn't happen in France. And we interrogate, why is that happening? What's the case? It isn't, as some people would claim, that the level of migration has fallen over time. In fact, migration across regions in the UK is high by international standards and hasn't fallen. It's as high as it ever has been, which is not the story in the US, where there has been a significant fall in migration across regions. But what we find is that once you move beyond nominal wages and incomes and look into real incomes, which we look at on the right by reducing incomes by housing costs, for everyone except those in the top sort of 25 to 10% of the income distribution, moving to London from somewhere like Yorkshire will not make you better off in real terms, because high house prices erode the benefit of the higher wages in London. And in fact, what we observe is a net outflow of people from London, because for all except at the very top end of the labour market, it doesn't make financial sense for you to be there. And then you can layer on top of that some other research around, for instance, the importance of social networks, being near your family so they can provide childcare. And you can see why this convergence mechanism is unlikely to drive more regionally balanced growth in the UK. So then finally, and then I'll open this up to questions, summing it all up, we think skills is likely not the constraint to growth in regions outside of London and the South East. We, by international standards, have lots of very highly skilled people in lots of pretty depressed economies. We think that there's a case for, we don't think that there's a case that normal bank lending is a constraint to growth in the regions. And we don't think just moving around and leaving it to the market mechanism is going to work to help rebalance growth in the UK. So on the positive side, where we think there's a case for intervention is around improving access to science skills, in particular through STEM degrees. And we can get into this, but it's also the finding holds for further education and STEM across the education system. We think there's a case for investing in transport infrastructure in congested non-London cities, and using public R&D spending to move to where the private sector is saying there is appetite for innovation, and at the moment the central government isn't doing enough to support that, or isn't matching the private sector in its efforts. And then we think that there is a specific argument for equity financing and looking at what we can do to improve the equity finance environment in some regions of the UK, whilst also taking steps to address limited housing availability, especially in London and the South East. Okay, I've just talked at you for 26 minutes and not seen any human faces. So I'm going to pause there, open for questions, and then we can interrogate any of that in detail if that's helpful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan. A very interesting presentation. Lots to kind of take from that. Does anybody have any questions, any thoughts, any comments? If anybody doesn't want to share out loud, feel free to put them in the comments. But if you're able to just raise your hand either on the screen or on the raise hand function, if you do want to say anything, that would be most appreciated. So James Gilmore has his hand up. Would you like to pass over to you, James?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for the presentation, Dan. Really good. Just wanted to check that I'm understanding the regional migration dynamic correctly. This is just about wages. So it's about wage convergence. It's not saying that productivity would converge over time.
So I think that there's not a straightforward answer to that question, James, because it depends on what's your underlying model of how regional economies work. And if you'll indulge me, there's, I think, 3 broad underlying theories of how regional economies work, which we're trying to grapple with in this paper. One is that you just need to get the right inputs in place, and then within a region, its economy will develop in a certain trajectory. So if you have the right mix of skills, industrial structure, transport and infrastructure, you can get growth. And that's the way of thinking about a regional economy as if it was a national economy. A second model is focused on coordination, and this is a lot of like the modern industrial strategy point of view, and it would say that just getting the right quantity and blend of inputs isn't sufficient. You need coordination mechanisms to make sure it all comes together. And then the third view is essentially it doesn't really matter what you do, because industrial strategy won't work. It will just displace economic activity that otherwise would happen. And the objects of national policy should be to help that convergence and that clearance of markets as much as possible over time. So this is the view which was long prevalent in the UK, that we shouldn't be trying to grow everywhere. We should be making it easier for people to move to London and the southeast. Our findings suggest that all 3 of those views have a bit of merit, that we probably don't put enough into transport, that we could do more to coordinate localized externalities, but also that we could do more to encourage migration to London and the southeast. Given that we don't quite know which one of those 3 underlying models is right, our conclusion is better to try and push on all of those different dimensions at the same time. So you would get some gains to productivity in the regions from industrial strategy. The productivity implication, and this takes on your question directly, of migration is ambiguous, because on the one hand, it could lead to more efficient sorting of people across places. Within London, it could, depending on how much there are like sorting failures at the moment within the London labour market, there could be a productivity gain. And really, this is like taking London's agglomeration economy even further would be the view there. If you could get convergence towards London. The question is whether the productivity gain in London from more agglomeration would outweigh the productivity loss from lower agglomeration in other regional economies. So it's ambiguous for the net national productivity effect. And then within London, there's also an ambiguity, because there's productivity gain from agglomeration, but then there would be a reduction in wages, which is your best proxy for productivity, because of more competition in the labour market.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for the question, James, and for the answer, Dan. Dan, are you okay just to take your presentation off the screen so people can see when you answer the question? Thank you very much. Has anybody else got any questions at all? Feel free to raise your hand or use the thing. Lewis Adams has got a question. Over to you, Lewis.
Hi, Dan. Fantastic presentation. Really personally interested in regional inequality in the UK, so I found it very interesting. Just had a quick question on the implications for a region like South Yorkshire. So in terms of the findings there, do you think, in terms of how we would respond in terms of trying to fix this problem or tackle it at least here, would it be best to kind of focus on kind of promoting these high level STEM skills here first, or is it a case of trying to grow the business space and business demand for these skills first? So it's kind of the question is, how do we fix this or address this first? Do we start with the supply side of the market or the demand side?
Yeah. Great question, and that's getting to the heart of what we're looking at. If I can I share just a little bit of the history, which I think will make sense to a lot of people, but it will help me answer some of that question as well. Can you see those slides all right? Cool.
Yeah.
So there's a few historical points that I just want to make. One is that, as we know, from the late 1970s and early 1980s, what happened with the regional economies across the UK was very rapid job loss due to what was happening in the industrial clusters. So for us, I'll talk more specifically about South Yorkshire just because it's easier and that's the world I'm inhabiting anyway. As there was a big loss of jobs, not necessarily in terms a loss of output in things like steel or coal from the late 1970s to 1980s, you had a large surge in variation across the country in unemployment levels. So somewhere like South Yorkshire, for those who still had a job, the productivity didn't look that different to people in London. But what did look very different was the high level of unemployment relative to a region like London. And we've gone, and this was mainly something that happened in the late 1990s, early 2000s, from a world where there was very high regional inequality of unemployment to very high regional inequality of productivity. To the degree that we now have as much regional inequality in the UK as North or South Italy or as East and West Germany. I think people will already know that our cities just underperform in their size. But what I want to show you are these slides. So industry used to be a major driver. If you had a high share of your economy in manufacturing in the 1970s, your economy was way more fragile compared to London and the Southeast, which had a high share of its economy in knowledge-intensive business services. And we saw deindustrialization here on a really remarkable scale. So this is one of the things that surprised me most when we were doing the research, that deindustrialization in the UK's regions in the 70s and 80s happened faster and to a deeper extent than anywhere else in Western Europe. And the only comparable historical episode to it was the experience of East European economies in the decade after the end of communism. So the scale and the pace and the disruption of industrial change in the UK was absolutely huge, and in regions like South Yorkshire in particular. So the reason I say that is to set up that, sorry, am I still sharing my slides? Not anymore. Great. So the reason I give that context is I think that business demand is the key takeaway for somewhere like South Yorkshire. It's not the case that we need more skills per se, although at the margin, I think there are some STEM skills that are needed. I think what we need are more high productivity, high skill, high caliber firms who are creating jobs for the graduates who are already here in South Yorkshire. The reason it's particularly hard for us is that deindustrialization happened so badly that the industrial clusters that otherwise would exist and provide the basis from an industrial strategy point of view were effectively eliminated from most of the UK outside of London and the Southeast, where they retained that historic strength in knowledge-intensive business services at exactly the same time that the market started to really value those skills. So we need to take the cluster, the nascent cluster that we have, try and supercharge it as much as we can. And part of that is through the equity finance argument. So how do we funnel equity into high growth potential firms that are emerging from those clusters? And that should create this virtuous circle, we would argue, the evidence suggests is plausible, in which businesses grow, they demand higher skills, people who are studying at Hallam or at Sheffield go straight into those jobs, and our economy very rapidly ascends up that skill profile structurally. Now, the only wrinkle to that is we think you also need effective public transport because none of that is any good if people can't get around and you're just like bottled up within your local economy. So the conclusion that I take from this for our work in South Yorkshire is fix public transport, so it's relatively easy to move around. That will also bring benefits that the labour market is larger, sorting is more efficient, agglomeration effects kick in a bit more. But really then your goal is find the firms who are going to demand higher level skills and give them whatever support they need to grow in an employment rich way as quickly as they can.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for the question, Lewis, and thank you for the question, Lewis, and thank you for the answer, Dan. There's another hand up. Is it Ewan, is it?
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Over to you.
Dominic. Just thank you, Dan. That was a really great presentation. And just touching on a few of those things that you spoke about just now, how do you feel the government's policy interventions, particularly in terms of levelling up in regions, specifically things like investment zones and free ports, how does that relate to things? Because you're saying we need to attract these firms for productivity. That's exactly what they think they're going to do with an investment zone. Just wondering what your thoughts were on that, especially South Yorkshire.
Yeah.
South Yorkshire is in line for one, if I'm correct. Yeah,
that's right. So the historic attitude towards policies that try to get economic activity in a specific area. So you mentioned there free ports, I think rightly tying them to investment zones, before that enterprise zones and so on. The long-standing economic view was from what I earlier called like the third school of thought, that most spatial interventions you can do or place-based interventions you can do just displace activity, displace money, displace people that would be more efficiently put to use elsewhere in the country. And so often, the caricature would be, and the caricature in South Yorkshire would be, if you create something like an investment zone and its assumption is tax breaks or some other incentive just brings activity to a region, or you get our firms that would have set up down the road, they move there so that they get a tax incentive to be there, and as soon as that tax incentive wears off, they leave. What I think the evidence base is suggesting is that there is a way you can do that spatially targeted work that has more additionality if you do it in a smarter way, which is to say you limit the firms who are eligible. So you make it more about really consciously trying to lean into those clustering dynamics of, if you have 10 firms in advanced manufacturing and they're crying out for someone who can make very high-end, vials or whatever it is, try and find a company that can make those high-end vials and only let them move in there. Don't let Amazon set up another warehouse there. So being really selective about the particular firms in order to create a dynamic is important. And the tax incentives don't really work either. The firms that are attracted in by the tax incentives are almost always not the ones who are attracted in because they want to be part of that business community. And it's about how do you connect, you create like the right business community, the right set of firms, the right mixture of firms, so that they're all mutually reinforcing, and then you provide the public goods that will help realize their potential. Some of which will be obvious. It's like, you need to decontaminate this particular site, you need to make sure that they have a tram stop, whatever it might be. Some of which are less obvious. So there might be particular innovation projects that will be really helpful for that industrial cluster that UKRI can't see because they're too far from it, and so on. Which is an oblique way of saying, I think investment zones actually go quite a long way towards doing this in a more thoughtful and intelligent way. And they're quite interesting in that regard, like ideologically, because it's saying we can kind of outwit the market and be selective, even though the origin of this, as we all know, was under Liz Truss, where it was, let's tear up all the regulation, and the problem is planning and local government saying yes or no. Whereas the current incarnation of investment zones doesn't seem to be falling into that trap, but too soon to tell.
No, it's just Freeport's point too. If you look at the tax breaks and everything else they get.
Yeah, so I think Freeports are an example of some of the older way of thinking, and haven't quite delivered to the hype as a result.
Thank you very much for your question and for your answer again, Dan. We've got some comments in the chat from Laurie, looking at kind of the comments around innovation, saying how needs to seek local and regional policy on innovation, and the kind of imbalance between jobs and skills and things around that. Are there any more questions at all? around any of the issues that Dan's raised, feel free to put your hand up or talk. In the meantime, Dan, I do have a question for you around some of the comparisons that you were making between the other countries, particularly Italy and Germany, and the regional inequality there. And I'm very kind of interested to hear how we learn from those and the transformations that took place there, and how we firmly move away from the London dominance.
Yeah, well, I suppose I should say, first of all, there's nothing in our paper to say in our analysis that any of this is bad. This is just kind of like, this is where we are. It's not obvious that that we could do better, and that would be like a classic critique of people who try to do regional policy, is any intervention you do can actually just make it worse because you're making the economy less efficient or effective than it could be. Having said that, we do refer at the start of our paper to a lot of an emerging evidence base that when you have localized or regionalized economic challenges, that leads to a wider set of social challenges. So things around public health outcomes, family breakdown, crime, a lot of the ills that people would be concerned about that go beyond pure economic outcomes. And that it's also starting to translate into a political map. And again, this is, I'm sure a lot of people in school know Philip McCann and his work, and he calls this a geography of discontent, of the places that have fallen behind in relative terms, and so recognize or believe a growth model isn't working for them. So I do think, even though our paper doesn't address this head on, that regional inequalities are a problem. I suppose I should have said that up front, for the people who are on the receiving end of it, and for the way that it destabilizes the politics, and therefore doesn't enable an effective political response. So that leads me to directly answer your question, Dominic. When I showed the slide that we now have regional income inequality comparable to East and West Germany or South and North Italy, what I didn't show is the trends over time on that. And it won't surprise you that in Germany, the trend is getting better. So there is convergence between the regions. In Italy, it's kind of like staying fairly level pegging. And in the UK, it's getting significantly worse, and it still is. So all of the stats that have emerged over the past few years, post all of the rhetoric and policy initiatives around so-called levelling up, have continued to see London pull away from the other regions of the UK. So we are continuing to diverge. We were actually one of the most equal countries in the world in the 1970s. And as recently as in 2008, the World Bank published a report on regional inequalities where they said, as you industrialize, inequality just happens because all these equality will happen because market mechanisms lead to convergence and so on and so forth. And they used the example of the UK as being very unequal when you had just Manchester and London powering ahead in the early 1800s, and then very equal by the time you get to the 1970s, which was their data at that point. There has always been a north-south gap, but our regional inequality was the lowest of any advanced country into the late 1970s. So we've gone from being the least unequal to almost, and by some measures, the most unequal in a very short window of time. Other countries haven't. Some countries, like Germany, have gone along the opposite path. So it shows that it is at least possible to make a dent in a world where you really have to run to stand still because of other factors around the economy that would drive regional inequality anyway. There's a political question or a governance question, mind what you say, Dominic, of if you need strong political will and you need to run to stay still on regional inequalities, how do you get that, and why haven't we had it for the past 40 years? Which is the topic of my second paper. And it's very complicated. I think the headline would be, in order to have sustained political will needed to force Whitehall to trust local government and regional government, which is one of our conclusions, you would need to be able to broker a cross-party political consensus on the need for devolution and on the particular vehicle for devolution, so that you don't get, the next time there's a change in government, a back to the drawing board approach where they wipe away regional institutions, as with RDAs in the 2010s, as with LEPs in the past couple of years, potentially with MCAs in whichever government forms from the next parliament. And you just bed in an institution with enough stability in funding, in political backing, to be able to build capability and to make a dent on these things. The Institute for Government published a report 2 years ago on the policy areas in the UK that have seen the most chop and change over time. And the top 3 areas were regional policy, skills policy, and industrial policy. So the 3 things that a lot of us in this call work on have seen the most disruption over the past 30, 40 years of any policy area in the UK. So it's no surprise that it hasn't really worked. But you need politics to change in order to stop that chop and change.
Thank you for the answer. Philip Cooper's got his hand up, and then I think after that we'll have time for one more. So over to you, Philip.
Hi, I was just wondering, you talked about the geography of discontent, and is there a link between what you've done here with economics and numbers and things around and any metrics of happiness, which is something that we kind of started to talk about a few years ago and then stopped?
Yeah.
Is there evidence to show that this region is less happy than, say, London, for example, because of the fact that we have? And the other link that I was hoping you might make, or you maybe already have, is to do with health inequality, which I think happiness kind of interlinks with. And is there a link there with stuff that we should be doing intervention wise with health?
Yeah, so there is evidence. It's quite contested. I think the best thing on this is the Deaton inquiry review, which came out last year, and looks exactly at this question of regional inequalities and well-being. What they find is that actually well-being is way more regionally equal than you would expect. And part of this is, as you were alluding to, Philip, that the science of well-being has come on a lot over the past 10, 15 years. And what are the components of well-being? We understand much better. Some of them are seen more in London and the Southeast. So having a good, well-paying job, having a sense of agency, having a sense of dynamism is really good for your well-being. Some of them, like not working particularly long hours, having a relatively short commute and so on, are more likely to occur in somewhere like Yorkshire and the Humber than they are in London and the Southeast. All of that, when you net it, and also like poor health is more likely here than it is in London. When you net that out, it makes well-being levels across the country look relatively similar. And this is one of the views that would say it's misplaced to worry too much about economic outcomes by region, and the money that we might spend trying to push water uphill to revive economies outside London and the Southeast would be better spent easing those constraints to well-being in London, especially around housing, and helping more people move there and get more of the good stuff. So it's the snapshot is we're relatively equal by well-being. The level of detail under that is there are different drivers of well-being across different regions. The policy implication of that is quite ambiguous, and it's quite contested as well. So if you ask people, are you happy? Or if you look at some of the metrics, like do you trust people? Do you have a high level of well-being? Most of the places that say yes most frequently, which would include the Northeast, would include Northern Ireland. I think Yorkshire is like pretty high up there. Also have some of the highest levels of subscribing of mental health drugs for problems like depression, anxiety, and so on. So the metrics that we have point us in slightly different directions.
Thank you for that. Unfortunately, we have probably not got enough time for one more question. So just goes to say a big thank you to you all for joining. Hopefully you've learned something new. You've realised that it's a very complex field in terms of all these issues around regional inequality and productivity, and a big thank you to Dan Turner as well for giving up the time to come and so clearly presenting these findings. We will share the recording of the presentation and the slides in our next policy briefing, which will be out in the next 2 weeks. We are moving to a fortnightly briefing for the foreseeable future, and on that, if you are not on the list, please feel free to email economy@southyorkshire ca.gov.uk. And if you are on the list, please encourage colleagues to sign up that might be interested. Yes, Dan?
Sorry, Dom, I don't want to interrupt you, but can I give a parting thought, which is a response to Laurie's comment? So there's lots that's unclear and that we still haven't been able to grapple with that's in this paper. And I think Laurie raises one of them here, which is the proposition of like a place and its value and somewhere being just a good place to live as being attractive. And I think our analysis would say that probably helps by bringing in more graduates. The challenge that we have and that hasn't really been cracked yet is how do you convert that into a reason for businesses to come? Who knows? The other big unknown, which we haven't really discussed, is this question around finance and equity and so on, where the debate essentially is equity and finance just about getting the money that you need to go ahead? Or is there an endogenous thing here where if you get access to equity finance, what that brings with it is a financial ecosystem wrapped around it where you meet angel investors, similar sized firms or similar, early stage firms, and you help build a bit of a sense of a community of young entrepreneurs or people in the same sector who are moving in a certain direction. So again, that's really contested academically. My view and the work that I see our colleagues, especially in the University of Sheffield and through initiatives like Northern Gritstone that we've been involved with in the MCA, is that building that sense of community amongst entrepreneurs, connecting them into these resources that will help them grow their firm and selling them on. South Yorkshire has a really high quality of life, which has become easier post-COVID. Feels like a bundle of initiatives that has a lot of potential in it. But we can't really know for sure. And there are lots of places that try to do that and fail. And this is the whole vein of research that having like big cultural festivities doesn't actually tend to really move the dial on your underlying productivity. But I think that next level of thinking of culture as a way to help businesses grow could be onto a winner.
Thank you very much. And I think that really sums up neatly what today's been about, and they're very well put together. So yeah, we have got plans for future webinars, and those details will be announced in our fortnightly policy briefings that come out. So it's once again, a really big thank you to Dan, and thank you to all for coming along, and we hope to see you soon. It just goes to say now, have a lovely day and a great weekend. Enjoy the sunshine. Bye everyone.